They called it the crate the Liberator flew in. German fighter pilots, veterans of the Eastern Front and the defense of the Reich, men who had faced Soviet Yaks and British Spitfires, or looked at the consolidated B-24 Liberator with something approaching contempt. The bomber was huge, ungainly, with its slab-sided fuselage and high-mounted Davis wing. It looked to experienced eyes like exactly what it was, a flying freight car, built for cargo capacity rather than grace. Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Jabs, flying Messerschmitt Bf-1-10 night fighters out of Venlo in the Netherlands, told his squadron mates that attacking a B-24 formation was less dangerous than engaging the B-17 Flying Fortress. The Liberator was slower to respond to threats, he claimed. Its pilots fought their controls rather than flying with precision. The aircraft wallowed in formation, unable to maintain tight defensive boxes. Most importantly, approach it from dead ahead, and the nose offered minimal defensive armament. On August 1, 1943, over the oil refineries at Ploesti, Romania, Luftwaffe pilots prepared to intercept the largest strategic bombing raid yet attempted in the European theatre. Intelligence had warned them something significant was coming. Reconnaissance had spotted heavy bomber concentrations in North Africa. But nothing in their experience, nothing in their training, prepared them for what emerged from the morning haze. 178 B-24 Liberators, flying at treetop level, approaching at 300 miles per hour. Not the expected high-altitude formation they had trained to intercept. Not a modest force of 30 or 40 bombers. Nearly 200 of the supposedly clumsy, vulnerable aircraft coming in so low that pilots could see Romanian farmers in the fields below scrambling for cover. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching. From today, this was not how strategic bombing worked. Heavy bombers operated at 20,000 feet or higher, relying on altitude and defensive armament to survive. They came in tight formations, their overlapping fields of fire creating aerial fortresses that fighters attacked at their peril. The tactics were established, understood, practiced, but the Americans were not following the established doctrine. They were doing something that should have been impossible, something that transformed every assumption about what the B-24 could or could not do. The German pilots, confident in their assessment of the Liberator's vulnerabilities, found themselves facing a weapon system they had fundamentally misunderstood. The aircraft they had mocked, the bomber they considered inferior to the Flying Fortress, was about to demonstrate that in warfare, tactical employment matters as much as technical specifications. The story of how German fighter pilots came to respect and fear the B-24 Liberator begins not with the raid itself, but with the aircraft's origins and the very real flaws that justified Luftwaffe contempt. Understanding why they were wrong requires first understanding why they believed they were right. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was not designed to be beautiful. It was designed to be built in enormous quantities, to carry heavy bomb loads over long distances, and to be manufactured by workers who had never built an aircraft before. Reuben Fleet, founder of Consolidated Aircraft Corporation, received a contract from the United States Army Air Corps in March 1939. The specification called for a heavy bomber with longer range than the Boeing B-17, greater bomb capacity, and higher speed. The Air Corps wanted an aircraft that could reach targets the Flying Fortress could not, carrying more ordnance, and return to base. Consolidated's chief engineer, Isaac M. Ladden, approached the problem with brutal pragmatism. The B-17 was aerodynamically refined, with its graceful curves and carefully shaped fuselage. It was also expensive to build and difficult to manufacture in the quantities the coming war would demand. Ladden designed something different. The B-24's fuselage was essentially a rectangular box, a cylinder with flat sides and a flat bottom. This simplified construction enormously. Sheet metal workers who had built car bodies or worked in appliance factories could rivet together a B-24 fuselage with minimal training. The shape was aerodynamically inefficient, creating drag, but it maximized internal volume for fuel tanks and bomb storage. The wing was Ladden's most significant innovation and his most controversial decision. He chose the Davis airfoil, a high aspect ratio wing with exceptional lift-to-drag characteristics. On paper, the Davis wing was superior to the B-17's wing in almost every measurable way. It generated more lift with less drag, enabling higher speeds and longer range. But the Davis wing had a critical flaw that would not become apparent until pilots began flying combat missions in formation. The wing had very high wing loading, meaning the aircraft's weight was distributed over relatively less wing area than comparable bombers. High wing loading made the aircraft less forgiving. It required higher approach speeds for landing. It reduced maneuverability. Most critically, it made formation flying physically exhausting. A B-17 pilot could trim his aircraft and maintain formation position with relatively small control inputs. The Flying Fortress was stable, forgiving, almost gentle in its handling characteristics. A B-24 pilot fought his aircraft constantly. The Liberator wanted to slip out of formation. It required constant attention, constant correction, constant physical effort on the controls. After 6 or 7 hours in formation, B-24 pilots were exhausted in ways B-17 pilots were not. Their arms ached, their legs cramped from holding rudder pressure. The aircraft was demanding work, and in the stress of combat, that mattered. German fighter pilots noticed. They observed B-24 formations from distance before committing to attack. They saw bombers that struggled to maintain tight defensive positions. They saw aircraft that wallowed slightly, that seemed less stable than the Flying Fortress formations they had engaged previously. Intelligence officers compiled reports. The B-24 was assessed as more vulnerable than the B-17, easier to isolate from formation, less capable of defensive maneuver. The assessment was not entirely wrong. The B-24 did have weaknesses that justified German tactical preferences for engaging Liberators over Flying Fortresses when both were present. Defensive armament was the most obvious vulnerability. Early production B-24D models, which bore the brunt of combat operations in 1942 and early 1943, mounted 10 50 caliber machine guns. This sounds formidable until compared to late model B-17Gs, which carried 13 guns with better fields of fire. More critically, the B-24's nose was nearly undefended on early models. A single handheld 50 caliber machine gun, operated by the bombardier, provided the only forward defense. The bombardier had other responsibilities during the bomb run, operating the Norden bomb site, tracking the target, releasing ordnance at the precise moment. He could not simultaneously man his gun effectively. German fighter tactics evolved to exploit this weakness. Experienced pilots approached B-24 formations from 12 o'clock high, diving slightly to maintain speed, firing their nose-mounted cannons and machine guns into the bomber's vulnerable fronts. A Focke-Wulf 4-190, with its 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, could pour devastating fire into a Liberator's nose, cockpit, and forward fuselage. The pilots had no armor protection in front. The instrument panel offered no meaningful shielding. Cannon shells that penetrated the nose could travel the length of the bomber, striking crew members throughout the forward fuselage. If the pilot was killed or wounded, the co-pilot faced the nearly impossible task of maintaining formation position while the damaged aircraft tried to drop out of formation, making it even more vulnerable. Luftwaffe pilots shared their assessments in ready rooms, in after-action debriefings, in the informal networks through which tactical knowledge spread. The B-24 was easier to kill than the B-17. Given a choice of targets, engage the Liberators first. Approach from the nose if possible. The American bomber crews knew it too, understood their vulnerability, and flew anyway. The planning for Operation Tidal Wave began in June 1943 at a conference in Algiers. Major General Louis H. Brereton, commanding the 9th Air Force in North Africa, received orders to destroy the oil refineries at Ploesti, Romania. These refineries supplied approximately 30% of Germany's crude oil and refined petroleum products. Without Ploesti's output, the Wehrmacht's mechanized divisions would run dry within months. The target was known, obvious, and heavily defended. Ploesti lay deep in Axis territory, over 1,000 miles from Allied air bases in North Africa. German intelligence knew the refineries were a critical vulnerability. They had positioned flak batteries throughout the refinery complexes, stationed fighter squadrons at nearby airfields, and installed early warning radar to detect incoming raids. A conventional high-altitude bombing attack would be detected hours before arrival, giving defenders time to scramble fighters and prepare anti-aircraft defenses. The bombers would face intense opposition throughout their bomb runs. Accuracy from 20,000 feet against industrial targets was poor. The Norden bomb site, despite its reputation, achieved circular error probabilities measured in hundreds of feet under combat conditions. Colonel Jacob E. Smart, on General Henry H. Arnold's advisory council, proposed an alternative that seemed operationally insane. Attack at low altitude. Come in below radar coverage. Navigate at treetop level across occupied Europe. Arrive over the target before defenders could react, and bomb from under 500 feet altitude. Low-altitude attacks eliminated many advantages heavy bombers possessed. Speed at low altitude was reduced by denser air. Defensive armament designed for high-altitude fighting against climbing fighters would be less effective against ground-based flak shooting horizontally. Any mechanical failure, any navigation error, any unexpected obstacle would be immediately fatal with no altitude for recovery. But low altitude offered accuracy. Bombardiers could see their targets clearly, identify specific structures, aim visually without relying on bomb site calculations. Surprise would be nearly complete. And most, critically, the attack profile would negate Ploesti's radar-directed flak batteries, which were calibrated for high-altitude defense. Brereton approved the plan. 5 bomb groups were assigned to the mission: the 44th, 93rd, 98th, 376th, and 389th. All flew B-24 Liberators. The mission required maximum range, and despite its handling difficulties, the Liberator had range the B-17 could not match. Training began in earnest. Crews flew practice missions over the North African desert, navigating at altitudes between 50 and 300 feet. They learned to judge height by watching their shadows on the ground, to avoid obstacles by milliseconds of reaction time, to maintain formation while skimming terrain. Navigation would be entirely visual. Radio silence was mandatory. Any transmissions would alert German listening posts. Lead navigators studied photographs and maps until they could identify landmarks from memory. The route was direct: across the Mediterranean, over the Albanian coast, across Yugoslavia, into Romania, following rivers and mountain valleys to avoid populated areas where observers might report their heading. Each group was assigned specific targets within the Ploesti complex. The 44th Bomb Group under Colonel Leon W. Johnson would strike the Columbia Aquila refinery. The 93rd under Lieutenant Colonel Addison E. Baker would hit the Astra Romana and Unirea Orion refineries. The 98th under Colonel John R. Kane would attack the Concordia Vega refinery. The 376th and 389th would strike Romana Americana and Creditul Minier. Timing was critical. All groups needed to arrive simultaneously, overwhelming defenses, preventing effective response. A few minutes' separation would allow flak batteries to concentrate on each wave successively, multiplying casualties. The crews trained for 6 weeks. They studied scale models of the refineries, memorizing the locations of cracking towers, storage tanks, power stations. They practiced delayed fuse bombing, learning to drop ordnance that would detonate seconds after impact, allowing the bomber to clear the blast radius. On July 31st, 1943, 177 B-24 seconds took off from bases around Benghazi. 1 aircraft aborted shortly after takeoff with mechanical problems. The remaining 176 proceeded across the Mediterranean in loose formation, climbing to 10,000 feet for the sea crossing, then descending as they approached the Albanian coast. Navigation errors began almost immediately. The lead navigator in Brigadier General Uzal G. Ent's aircraft misidentified a turn point. Instead of following the planned route northeast toward Bucharest before turning northwest to Ploesti, the formation continued north, directly toward the Romanian capital. The error was not discovered for nearly 30 minutes. When the navigators realized their mistake, the formation was miles off course, approaching from the wrong direction. The carefully rehearsed attack plan, with each group assigned specific approach routes to their designated targets, was compromised. Colonel Keith K. Compton, leading the 376th Bomb Group in the lead position, made a command decision. Rather than waste time and fuel returning to the correct approach route, he would proceed directly to Ploesti from their current position. He assumed the other groups would follow. They did not all follow. The formations split. Some groups followed Compton. Others, recognizing they were approaching from the wrong direction, broke off to find their assigned targets from memory and visual navigation. The element of surprise, which the entire mission concept depended upon, was partially lost. Anti-aircraft batteries had time to orient on the incoming bombers. Fighter squadrons at Mizil and Pipera airfields received alert warnings and began launching aircraft. The raid that was supposed to arrive as a coordinated simultaneous strike from multiple directions came in piecemeal, allowing defenders to shift focus between threats. At 0 to 400 hours local time, the first B-24 seconds reached Ploesti's outskirts. They came in at rooftop level, so low that crews could see Romanian civilians in the streets looking up in shock. The bombers roared over neighborhoods, over fields, toward the massive refinery complexes that dominated the landscape. German and Romanian flak crews opened fire, but these were not the radar-directed heavy batteries designed for high-altitude defense. These were light and medium anti-aircraft guns, 20mm and 37mm weapons, mounted on ground platforms and firing horizontally at bombers passing at their own altitude. Tracer fire arced across the refineries. Bombers flew through streams of shells, some taking hits that tore through thin aluminum skin, others passing through unscathed by chance. The Liberators returned fire with their own guns, waist gunners and tail gunners, shooting at flak positions, at ground targets, at anything that presented itself. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Colonel Baker's B-24, nicknamed Hell's Wench, took heavy damage on the approach. The nose was hit, killing the navigator and bombardier. Fuel tanks were holed, streaming gasoline that created vapor trails behind the aircraft. Baker could have aborted, turned away, attempted to reach friendly territory. Instead, he maintained position, leading his formation toward their target. The Liberator was on fire. Flames spread from the leaking fuel tanks, consuming the wing. Baker held course until his bombardier, or perhaps Baker himself operating the manual release, dropped the bombs on target. Only then did Hell's Wench begin losing altitude, unable to maintain flight with the structural damage and fire consuming the airframe. The bomber crashed into the target area. There were no survivors. The bombers came in waves, each group striking their assigned targets or whatever refinery they could identify through the smoke and chaos. Delayed fuse bombs detonated as aircraft passed overhead, creating mushroom clouds of flame and black smoke that rose thousands of feet. Some bombers flew through the explosions from aircraft ahead of them, their own bombs contributing to destruction that made navigation impossible. Colonel Kane's 98th Bomb Group approached the Concordia Vega refinery from the north, finding their target obscured by smoke from previous attacks. Kane led his formation directly into the inferno, maintaining formation discipline while flying through flames and explosions. Aircraft emerged from the smoke with paint scorched off, fabric control surfaces burning, but still flying. The 389th Bomb Group, led by Colonel Jack W. Wood, arrived over Ploesti to find massive fires already consuming multiple refineries. Wood identified his assigned target, the Steaua Romana refinery, and led his group through the smoke. His own aircraft, brewery wagon, was hit by flak shortly before bomb release. The pilot fought to maintain control long enough to drop ordnance, then pulled up sharply, attempting to gain altitude for the crew to bail out. The aircraft exploded before reaching safe altitude. Wood and his crew died in the blast. German fighters arrived during the attack, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s from fighter groups stationed at Misil. They found targets everywhere, damaged bombers struggling to gain altitude, formations breaking up after bomb runs, individual aircraft separated from their groups. The fighter pilots attacked with standard tactics, approaching from favorable angles, firing their cannons at close range. Immediately, torn apart by 20mm shells. Others absorbed punishment, their crews fighting back with defensive fire, limping away from Ploesti with engines smoking and control surfaces damaged. But the fighters could not stop the attack. There were too many bombers, arriving too quickly, from too many directions. By the time German pilots engaged their targets, most B-24 seconds had already dropped their ordnance. The refineries were burning. Storage tanks exploded with concussive force that could be felt miles away. Cracking towers collapsed into molten wreckage. The bombers that survived the target area turned for home, flying low across Romanian countryside, pursued by fighters and engaged by every anti-aircraft position along their route. The flight back to North Africa would take hours, over mountains and sea, with no possibility of fighter escort and no alternative landing sites if damage made the full distance impossible. Luftwaffe pilots who engaged the raid filed. After-action reports that differed significantly from their previous assessments of B-24 capabilities. The bombers had performed a mission profile that should have been impossible for heavy aircraft. They had navigated over 1,000 miles, much of it at altitudes under 500 feet, maintaining formation discipline under conditions that would have scattered less experienced crews. They had pressed attacks through flak concentrations that would have deterred high-altitude formations. Aircraft that took damage sufficient to make flight questionable continued their bomb runs rather than aborting. The defensive gunnery was effective. Several German fighters were damaged or destroyed by return fire from bombers that were themselves burning or crippled. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Steinmann, flying a Bf-109 out of Misil, engaged a B-24 that was trailing smoke from its No. 3 engine. He approached from 7 o'clock high, the standard fighter attack angle, expecting the wounded bomber to be easy prey. The waist gunner engaged him at effective range, his tracer fire walking across Steinmann's approach path. Steinmann broke off, reassessed, tried again from a different angle. The tail gunner fired sustained bursts that forced another break. When Steinmann finally positioned for a killing shot, the bomber's pilot threw the damaged aircraft into a banking turn that should have been impossible given the visible structural damage. Steinmann's cannon fire missed. By the time he repositioned, the bomber had joined another formation, its defensive guns combining with 4 other aircraft to create overlapping fields of fire that made approach too dangerous. Steinmann returned to base, having expended most of his ammunition without achieving a confirmed kill. His report noted that the American crews demonstrated exceptional skill and determination. The aircraft he had engaged, which he estimated had sustained damage that would have forced most pilots to bail out, and continued flying toward North Africa. Of the 177 B-24 Liberators that departed North Africa on August 1, 1943, 54 failed to return. 33 were confirmed destroyed over or near Ploesti. 8 went down over the Mediterranean or occupied Europe. Several others crashed attempting emergency landings at Malta, Cyprus, or Sicily. 8 landed in neutral Turkey and were interned, their crews spending the remainder of the war in comfortable but enforced captivity. The casualty figures told a brutal story. 532 airmen were killed, missing, or captured. 100 men became prisoners of war in Romanian and German camps. The 8th Air Force in England, conducting high-altitude daylight raids over Germany during the same period, considered a 5% loss rate unsustainable. Operation Tidal Wave suffered a 30% loss rate. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions during the raid, the most ever awarded for a single military action. Colonel Leon Johnson received the medal for leading the 44th Bomb Group through intense flak to strike the Columbia Aquila refinery. Colonel John Kane received recognition for pressing his attack through fire and explosions at the Concordia Vega complex. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker and Major John Jerstad both received posthumous awards for continuing their attacks despite fatal aircraft damage. Second Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes, piloting a B-24 that took flak damage, rupturing its fuel tanks, maintained formation despite streaming gasoline. He completed his bomb run with the aircraft on fire, then attempted to gain altitude for his crew to bail out. The bomber exploded before reaching safe height. Hughes and several crew members died in the crash. The Medal of Honor citation noted his determination to complete the mission despite certain knowledge that his aircraft was doomed. The damage assessment teams evaluated Ploesti's refineries in weeks following the attack. The initial estimates were encouraging. 42% of the target area's refining capacity appeared destroyed or severely damaged. Photographic reconnaissance showed massive destruction. Cracking towers collapsed, storage tanks ruptured and burned out, processing facilities reduced to twisted metal. But Romanian and German engineers worked with remarkable efficiency. Within weeks, much of the damaged equipment was repaired or replaced. By September, Ploesti was producing at approximately 80% of pre-raid capacity. By November, the refineries had returned to full production. The strategic impact, purchased at such terrible cost, was temporary. The operational lessons, however, were permanent. Heavy bombers would not conduct another low-altitude strategic attack during the war. The losses were unsustainable, the risks unjustifiable. The B-24 and B-17 returned to high-altitude missions where their defensive armament and formation tactics provided better survivability. For Luftwaffe pilots, Ploesti provided uncomfortable evidence that their assessment of the B-24 had been incomplete. The Liberator was ungainly, difficult to fly, vulnerable in specific tactical situations. But in the hands of well-trained crews with adequate motivation, it could perform missions that seemed operationally impossible. The German fighter pilots who engaged bombers at Ploesti filed reports noting the Americans' tactical flexibility, their willingness to absorb catastrophic losses to complete mission objectives, and most significantly, the sheer number of bombers the United States could commit to a single target. 177 aircraft represented more heavy bombers than the Luftwaffe could concentrate for any single mission by mid-1943. Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, one of Germany's most successful night fighter pilots, later commented that Ploesti demonstrated American operational philosophy: accept terrible losses in individual missions, knowing that industrial capacity could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The specific quality of individual aircraft mattered less than the quantity available. This understanding spread through Luftwaffe fighter squadrons during late 1943 and into 1944. Intelligence reports documented American bomber production with numbers that seemed impossible to German planners. The consolidated aircraft plants in Fort Worth and San Diego, plus Ford's massive Willow Run facility in Michigan, were producing B-24 seconds at combined rates exceeding 1,000 aircraft per month by early 1944. The Ford Willow Run plant represented American industrial capacity at its most overwhelming. Henry Ford had initially resisted building bombers, preferring to focus on the B-24's engines rather than complete airframes, the government insisted. Ford committed to building 1 bomber per hour, a production rate that experts claimed was impossible. Ford constructed a purpose-built facility covering 3.5 million square feet under a single roof. The assembly line stretched over 1 mile in length. Components entered at one end: fuselage sections, wing panels, engines, propellers, armament, instruments. Completed bombers emerged at the other end, rolled out onto the airfield, and flew away to modification centers where combat equipment was installed. The factory employed 42,000 workers at peak production, many of them women who had never worked in manufacturing before the war. They learned to rivet aluminum skin, install hydraulic systems, wire electrical components, mount gun turrets. The work was precise, demanding, and absolutely critical. By 1944, Willow Run was producing one B-24 every 63 minutes. The plant's total output reached 8,600 Liberators before production ceased in June 1945. Combined with Consolidated's production at Fort Worth and San Diego, American factories built over 18,000 B-24 seconds during the war. German factories, operating under constant Allied bombing, resource shortages, and transportation disruptions, built approximately 6,000 Bf-109 fighters during 1944. The Focke-Wulf factories produced fewer than 3,000 FW-190s the same year. Every aircraft Germany built was needed immediately to replace losses. There was no reserve, no accumulation of strength, no margin for operational attrition. Luftwaffe pilots understood these numbers. They discussed them in ready rooms, calculated the mathematics of attrition in their heads during missions. If German fighters achieved a 10-to-1 kill ratio, the best ratio any air force had sustained in modern warfare, America would still win through sheer numerical superiority. The B-24 didn't need to be a perfect aircraft. It needed to be good enough, built in sufficient quantities, crewed by adequately trained pilots, and employed in overwhelming numbers. The Americans provided exactly that. By late 1944, 8th Air Force missions over Germany routinely involved over 1,000 heavy bombers, split roughly between B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds. 15th Air Force in Italy added hundreds more. The formations stretched for miles, their contrails marking the sky, their defensive fire creating aerial barrages that turned fighter attacks into calculated suicide. German pilots who had mocked the Clumsy Liberator in 1942 and early 1943 learned to respect it by 1944, not because the aircraft's technical characteristics had improved, but because the operational reality had changed. Individual aircraft quality mattered less than formation discipline, crew training, numerical superiority, and the certain knowledge that every bomber shot down would be replaced by 2 more within weeks. Major Gunther Roll, a Luftwaffe ace with over 270 confirmed victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, flew defensive missions against American bomber streams in late 1944. He later recalled that engaging a formation of 50 B-24 seconds was fundamentally different from engaging 50 individual aircraft. The bombers flew as a single entity, their combined defensive fire creating zones that fighters could not safely enter. Attacking required committing fully, accepting casualties, and hoping to destroy enough bombers before your own aircraft was hit. The bomber crews who survived Ploesti returned to operations within days. Some flew again within a week of the raid, replacing losses in their squadrons, training new crew members who arrived as replacements. The casualty rate remained high throughout 1943 and into early 1944, before the arrival of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts reduced bomber losses to marginally sustainable levels. Technical modifications addressed some of the B-24's defensive weaknesses. Later models mounted powered nose turrets with twin 50-caliber guns, eliminating the vulnerable approach angle German fighters had exploited. Additional armor-protected pilots and critical systems, improved oxygen systems, better heating for high-altitude flight, and upgraded armament increased crew survivability and effectiveness. But the fundamental characteristics remained. The B-24 was difficult to fly in formation. It required constant physical effort from pilots. Its high wing loading made it less forgiving than the B-17. Crews who flew both types almost universally preferred the Flying Fortress for its handling qualities and perceived survivability. Yet the B-24 flew more combat missions, dropped more bombs, and was produced in greater numbers than the B-17. It served in every theatre where the United States operated: Europe, North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, China, Burma, India. Navy patrol versions hunted submarines across Atlantic. Photo reconnaissance variants flew deep penetration missions over enemy territory. Transport versions hauled cargo across the Himalayas. The Liberator succeeded not because it was superior to alternatives, but because it was adequate for its missions and available in overwhelming quantities. This was America's fundamental approach to industrial warfare. Build equipment that was good enough, train crews adequately, produce everything in numbers that made individual losses acceptable, and employ forces with a certainty that losses would be replaced faster than the enemy could inflict them. German military planning had never accommodated this approach. Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, superior training creating elite pilots who could achieve kill ratios that offset numerical disadvantages. This worked when fighting Poland, France, and during the early Eastern Front campaigns. It failed when facing an opponent who could replace losses indefinitely. By 1945, experienced Luftwaffe pilots were increasingly rare. Training had been cut back due to fuel shortages. New pilots arrived at combat squadrons with minimal flight hours, sometimes less than 50 hours total flight time, and no combat experience. They faced American bomber crews who had survived 30 missions, who knew their aircraft intimately, who flew in formations perfected through years of combat operations. The outcome was predetermined. Germany's fighter pilots, no matter how skilled individually, could not overcome the mathematics of industrial attrition. The B-24 Liberator, clumsy and ungainly, adequate rather than excellent, represented exactly the weapon system needed to win that kind of war. Good enough, available everywhere, and built in numbers that made defeat impossible. The Luftwaffe pilots who had mocked the Liberator in 1942 learned this lesson repeatedly from Ploesti forward. They learned it over Regensburg and Schweinfurt. They learned it during Big Week in February 1944, when American bombers struck aircraft factories across Germany. They learned it on every mission throughout 1944 and 45, when the sky filled with bombers that kept coming despite losses, despite damage, despite everything German fighters could do. The B-24 that German pilots had dismissed as inferior to the B-17, that they had considered easier prey, flew 18,000 combat sorties over Europe. Crews who survived their tours returned to the United States, trained new crews, and sent them back to the war. The production lines kept running, the missions kept launching. Ploesti was the moment when mockery turned to respect, when individual aircraft assessment gave way to operational understanding. The bombers came in at treetop level because their commanders believed the mission was worth the cost. They absorbed 30% losses and returned to operations. They were replaced within weeks. The refineries burned, were rebuilt, and were bombed again at high altitude by larger formations later in the war. The lesson was clear to anyone paying attention. In industrial warfare between modern nations, material superiority matters more than individual quality. Production capacity matters more than technical elegance. The ability to sustain losses and continue operations matters more than achieving perfect kill ratios. The B-24 Liberator, for all its flaws, embodied these principles perfectly. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.